Hi, welcome once again to Senior Focus. I'm your host, Bill Adams, and Senior Focus is a show designed for people over the age of about 50, but of course, if you're younger than that, feel free to stay tuned. Hopefully you'll learn some things about the area you're living in, Mahoning County especially. And before we get started, I want to say thanks to Armstrong Cable and Greg Roten, who brings you the show every week, basically. And also thanks to the Youngstown Public Library. We're coming to you from the Austintown Library today for the use of their meeting rooms. And today we're going to have a guest on who's been on before. His name is Sean Posey. Welcome.
Thanks.
And Sean is a local historian who has done previous books about Youngstown history, and he has a brand new one, literally a week or two ago. But you've been working on this for a while, and it's called, well, I'll let you give the title.
Sure. It's called Historic Theaters of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley.
Okay.
And the book just came out on August 21st. It's my second book. And this was kind of, after I finished, we talked last year about Lost Youngstown. I had just kind of rolled right into writing this book.
Right.
And finished it fairly quickly, but it's been years in the offing, in the researching, basically.
And Youngstown has a tremendous history with theaters, but also with, what theaters show, movies. And I mean, why don't we go back to the very beginning, which is it the Nickelodeons? Is that, obviously I wasn't around and you weren't.
Sure.
What was that? What was a Nickelodeon?
Sure, so Nickelodeons, you're going back to the beginning of the 20th century, and the idea was behind it, they were the very first, what at the time they called often moving picture theaters. And Nickelodeons, oftentimes weren't any more sophisticated or complicated of an operation than maybe what you see in this room. A bunch of chairs, a very simple projector that broke down a lot, a screen to show it on, and a lot of the early films, people would come in and they called them Nickelodeons because often they'd pay a nickel or even less to see a film. And the film might be something as simple as, for example, there was a subgenre of films that was very popular called Firefighter Films, which were literally just films taken of fire crews going out and putting something out that was on fire.
Okay.
People were fascinated by this because at first the real novelty was motion.
Right.
And people hadn't seen this before. Something as simple as when Edison started making his first films, it was maybe two boxers boxing or someone dancing. So the first films were very simple, but by the early 1900s, you start to see the first narrative films, some of which people might have heard of, like The Great Train Robbery, which was literally, I think, maybe 15 minutes long. It might have not even been that long, and it was a very simple narrative film about some guys robbing a train. And that was actually the first film that the Warner Brothers showed when they were in the area in the early 1900s.
And so that was sort of an inspiration for them when they boy, this is exciting.
Right, yeah, the Warner Brothers, they weren't from this area, but they grew up in this area, and yeah, that's how they actually got interested in film, was the local Nickelodeons in the area. There was a guy by the name of George Ohlenhauser who was a machinist who operated a theater downtown called the Edisonia, a Nickelodeon, and he actually introduced Sam Warner to early film cameras, showed him how to take one apart, and eventually he got interested and bought his own camera, bought a copy of The Great Train Robbery, and the Warner Brothers went around the area showing their film in old storefronts, or at fairs in Niles, in Warren, in Youngstown, and in western Pennsylvania. And then in 1907, the Warner Brothers opened their very first theater in Newcastle.
Okay. Yeah, I knew there was a Newcastle connection. Were they originally from there, or
no, they were from here. But when they opened, when they wanted to open they were traveling around with their film, and they realized.
Right. So this is the first single theater that they.
Yeah, when they realized that once winter came, it was going to become difficult for them to find a place to show.
Right.
So they said, we need a storefront. They looked for one in Youngstown. There was too much competition. There was too many other Nickelodeons. So they ended up in Newcastle, which they were familiar with because they had been through the town there.
Yeah.
So it was almost Youngstown, but just by chance it became Newcastle.
So when they opened that first one in Newcastle, did they then come back to Youngstown or expand at all, or how? Is that when they took off for Hollywood?
Well, they had it for a while, and they eventually realized, initially that the money was in the distribution business, so they got involved in distributing films, and then of course eventually they end up going out to California to open their own studio.
Right.
But as I do mention in the book, later in 1931 they actually opened another theater here, the Warner Theater downtown, which was built in honor of Sam Warner, one of the brothers who died very young in 1927.
So Sam was the first one who passed away, but then who were the other brothers that
There was actually a brother before that. The only Warner that I know of that is actually buried in the area is Milton Warner. Milton was one of the younger brothers who was actually a star, standout athlete at the Rand School on the north side. He actually became a professional ball player, died young, and is buried somewhere in Youngstown. But yeah, Sam Warner. Sam Warner actually also got film experience at Agora Park. He operated a camera there for something called Hale's Tours, which is basically people would go into this old kind of carriage setup, and the carriage would move. It would to simulate motion, and people would see films of, say, Yosemite National Park, and they were trying to simulate like you were in a little car, traveling car, and you were going through these areas. So Sam Warner worked at that for a while, but in the 20s. He realized that sound was going to be the future of films. Now, the other Warner Brothers, and not very many other people, agreed with that. They thought, no, people don't want to hear sound. But he was actually one of the prime movers behind introducing sound pictures. And unfortunately, he died right before the premiere of The Jazz Singer, which was kind of the first one, the first talkie. So it was very tragic. But ultimately, his vision did come to life.
Well, what you were talking about sitting in the carriage and the film going by, that reminded me of Driver's Ed, where you would sit at the simulator and they'd project.
I hadn't thought of that, but
and then the baby would run out and you had to stop and all that kind of thing. Nickelodeon's, I remember at Agora Park, there was the crank. This might be before your time, but you cranked and the images moved. Is that similar to what a Nickelodeon was?
That would have been maybe similar to the very first. They did have viewing parlors where people would come in and there wasn't a projector or anything, but there would be an apparatus and you would put your eye down to it and you could see moving images. That was kind of maybe one of the first primitive storefronts that people had, but then eventually they were exhibiting films in kind of a very primitive version of the theater.
Right. And we'll get back to the Warner Theater, which again we know of today as what the Dior Arts or Powers Auditorium, right? And again, we're talking about historic theaters of Youngstown, and it's from the History Press, and Sean Posey is nice enough to be here and talk about with us. We have another interesting history, a little sidelight of the burlesque movies, or not movies, shows. But that goes into a whole thing about theaters weren't just for showing movies, they were for entertainment, vaudeville. How did that get started?
So obviously before there were Nickelodeons, there were other theaters here. There was a very elaborate theater downtown called the Grand Opera House, which was very popular. They showed plays like King Lear, Shakespeare, opera, of course. But they also showed some of the very first burlesque shows. So burlesque evolved from vaudeville, and if you're familiar with vaudeville, vaudeville was basically traveling groups of people doing skits for people, routines. Sometimes they would involve animals, and burlesque evolved from that. But by the 1920s, the 1930s, burlesque was basically, you would go to a burlesque house and you would see a comedy routine with what they called baggy pants comedians who would come out and do a routine.
With the seltzer.
And that would be a build up to the dancing girls who would come out and put on a show for the gentlemen. And in Youngstown it became, by the 1930s, 1940s, enormously popular. And by the late 1950s, Youngstown actually became, for a year, the headquarters for the Eastern Circuit of burlesque theaters.
Oh, I guess that's an honor of some sort. And again, in the vaudeville era, you're talking about people like maybe the Marx Brothers came through.
Yeah, there was a lot of them. A lot of the names today people wouldn't recognize, but an early person who came out of vaudeville, for example, that probably most people would recognize was Al Jolson. And Al Jolson played Youngstown many, many times at the Park Theater. knew this area very well and got to be friends with some of the managers in the area, lifelong friends.
And I think somewhere I heard that, was it Katharine Hepburn also came through Youngstown? I mean, some other actors and actresses?
Right. The Park Theater was a theater down on the east end of downtown, which is actually a very beautiful theater. And it started out as a theater that showed vaudeville, but also a lot of traveling Broadway road shows. And yes, people like Red Skelton came through there, of course. Comedian Katharine Hepburn, Ethel Barrymore, Harry Houdini performed at the Park Theater.
Wow.
So yeah, it was definitely a place that kind of a showcase theater for the area. And of course, Al Jolson played there very many times.
Right. So we have, again, we have the burlesque theaters downtown, but we also have what I guess you call the classic theaters. And you want to go through maybe one at a time. What there are 4 main ones down there?
Right. Yeah. They sometimes called them the big 4 theaters downtown. And that was the very first one, the Paramount Theater, the State Theater, both of which were on West Federal Street.
Okay.
The Palace Theater, which was down on Central Square, and then of course the last to be built, the Warner Theater, which was the largest.
And which one was right on the Central Square?
That was the Palace Theater.
That was the Palace,
right.
but it had another name at the Albey?
Yeah. It was originally called the Keith Albey Theater or the Keith Albey Palace, and Keith Albey were 2 gentlemen who actually started one of the biggest vaudeville circuits in the country. So when the Palace opened in 1926, it did show films, but it was mostly about vaudeville at that time. That was still the predominant form of entertainment. And they even had in the bowels of the building, they even had stalls big enough to wash horses, because a lot of the vaudeville acts would use animals in them. So yeah, that was what it started out. But probably within 10 years or so, during the later part of the Great Depression, vaudeville started to fade away, and it was all about films. But the Palace Theater still had a stage, an enormous stage. And so in the 1930s and 1940s, when big bands become popular, that's where they would come. So Frank Sinatra, Tommy Dorsey played at the Palace Theater. Glenn Miller played the Palace Theater. Pretty much any big band from the swing era, Duke Ellington, that you can think of played at the Palace live.
Oh, yeah. And this was a huge place, 2,500 seat, something like that?
Yeah, about 2,300 seats. And as I mentioned, it had a very large stage, the largest stage in the area. So it could show films, but it could also show vaudeville. It could also show, sometimes they would host comedians. The Three Stooges came and played at the Palace.
Oh, wow.
And then, of course, music acts were very big, too, in the early 50s, when Patti Page was out doing her big hit, the Tennessee Waltz. At the time, she came and played there, and that was a #1 hit at the time. So yeah, people probably got what we might think of as spoiled. You could go down for less than $1 and see some of the biggest acts in the country play live. Well,
why don't we talk? Why would we think of Youngstown now, but why would they have come here then? Was it, I guess Youngstown was a major city, or I mean, it wasn't the biggest city, but.
Well, in 1930, right around the 1930s, it was about 170,000 people in Youngstown, and it was about the 45th largest city in the country during the Great Depression. So yeah, and it had a nice central location in between Chicago and New York City, in between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. So a lot of traveling shows. This would just be a convenient place for them to play.
Right.
And over time, Youngstown was kind of seen as being a kind of a slice of middle America. So if an act was being tested out, or if a group was on tour trying to see how people reacted to a new album, a place like Youngstown was kind of seen as, the heart of middle America. So yeah, it became a good test market.
Well, another thought I had, and I don't know if there's any way to prove this or if it's just my thinking, but with our history of some nefarious characters, do you think that possibly they had influence? And I'm thinking about like Las Vegas, where the organized crime could bring people in.
Right.
Is that a possibility that maybe they attracted?
I couldn't speak to that in detail, but it certainly is a possibility. And organized crime was involved in aspects of burlesque too. So yeah, that would not surprise me.
Yeah, they had the money maybe to entice people to come in.
Right.
Well, so what are some of the other ones now? We've got we talked about one in depth And what's next down the
Right.
list?
Well, the first was the Liberty Theater, which later became the Paramount.
Paramount,
So,
okay.
so that was built in 1918, and it's kind of interesting because it was actually finished during World War I, which typically wouldn't happen because a lot of the structural steel was going towards the war effort.
Right,
But
okay.
since we were in a steel town, maybe it was easier
Yeah.
to get the project done. But when it was built, it was kind of the first theater in the area that was a sophisticated theater. The architecture harkened back to classical antiquity, and it was designed really, I think, to show people who previously would have been biased in favor of live theater, would have never gone to a Nickelodeon, to say, hey, you can come here and see a film, and this is still a dignified, respectable setting. There were smoking lounges for men and women.
Oh, okay.
It was furnished beautifully. As I mentioned, the architecture was first-rate neoclassical architecture. So it was really kind of the beginning of the downtown movie palaces. So Nickelodeons go from these little kind of dank, sometimes dangerous, hole-in-the-wall theaters to these enormous downtown palaces that can sit thousands of people,
Yeah.
and which really are a place that people went to and kind of felt, they weren't just going out to the Regal Theater. They were going
Right.
to a place where you wanted to get dressed up, a place that felt dignified, and a place where the surroundings kind of made you feel, almost in awe.
Yeah, I remember one of the opening night pictures, I guess, from the book where, people were all, I don't know if they had tuxes on, but they certainly had suits.
Sure.
And they're not wearing sweatpants like we might today, or
absolutely
leggings
not.
or anything like that.
Right, yeah, you would definitely wear, even if you went down to town at all, if you were a gentleman, you were going to wear a suit and a tie and probably a hat of some kind. And
Sure.
if you were a lady, you were going to wear a dress, you were going to wear your white gloves, and going out to the theater was, a very big deal.
Now, on the other side of Federal, you had what became the clubs that the younger people know, the Tomorrow Club and the Agora, but what was that originally?
Yeah, so the Tomorrow Club and the Agora, which a lot of people will probably remember that was originally all in the State Theater
That was
building.
in the State, okay.
So the State Theater was built, or it was finished in 1927, and a little bit, it was a smaller theater, at least compared to the Palace Theater, but it could still sit over 2,000, and it also had a stage too, so it showed vaudeville shows, and films early on, but it eventually became mostly a movie theater. In 1970, it closed, but just a few years later, it opened up as the Tomorrow Club, which
Okay.
had some of the biggest acts in the business. Lou Reed played there. Kiss played at the Tomorrow Club. That eventually closed, and then it became the Agora in the early 1980s, and it ended its life as the Star Palace, which was a place where the Temptations played,
Oh, wow.
and some of the early hip-hop acts like DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, which some people might at least know the name Will Smith.
Yeah,
he was
sure.
the Fresh Prince, and Salt and Pepper. So that particular theater had a very long and interesting life, moving from a movie theater eventually to basically a series of clubs that hosted some really big acts.
Now, did these places like that close down because of the economy, basically?
Yeah, I believe so. By the late 80s, it was just they weren't making enough money, and the theater needed a lot of work.
Right.
And by 2008, the theater had been sitting there for a very long time, and eventually they tore the State down. But if you go downtown today, you can still see the facade is still there.
Right,
But the
okay.
building itself is gone. But you can still see from the facade, what a beautiful place it must have been at one time.
Well, which brings us to the Warner, which, I think attracted a lot of attention when it was built, right? It was, and remains beautiful.
Right, when it was built, they started talking about it in the late 1920s, and I think probably the real impetus for building it was when Sam Warner died in 1927.
Right.
The first or second Warner brother to die very young, and it was really built in his honor, and it was $1 million project, and it was actually finished during the Great Depression. Right around 1931 it opened, actually during probably the worst years of the Great Depression. But when it was opened, it was probably one of the biggest events in the city, and it kind of was the cap of the downtown building boom, which had been going on for years. It was probably one of the last great projects to be built downtown, and the theater was so beautiful. they used a lot of rare woods that they imported from Africa, parts of Italy. They actually brought in some of the best theater artists to do some of the sculpture. And in later years, when they were renovating it, they actually couldn't replace some of the fineries that were originally in it because they were so rare. I mean, they really spared no expense. And so when this opened, it was a enormous deal for Youngstown. Really a theater that was on par with anything that you would have seen even in Chicago or New York City.
Yeah. Well, again, we have some great treasures, and thanks to like the Powers family for saving it back in the 60s.
Right.
Well, we've gone through the major theaters in downtown, but there were others. There was one, I know, on East Federal that you talk about that sort of catered to African American?
Right, yeah, there was a lot of theaters that today probably very few people would remember downtown. Theaters like the Cameo and the Capitol that kind of came and went fairly quickly. But yeah, there was a theater that was on East Federal Street for over 40 years called the Region, which was really pretty close to one of the original Nickelodeons. It was built in the early 1920s. It played a lot of cowboy and Indian films. You could have gone there and seen somebody like Tom Mix on screen.
Oh, yeah.
But eventually, by the 1940s, it, for whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure, had kind of transformed into a theater that catered to African Americans, and you could go see what they called race films at the time, which were basically films that had casts that were predominantly African American, Lena Horne, artists like that. And also, I interviewed a gentleman who went there during the 50s. It was a place where you could go and see a film that somebody had recorded of people like Miles Davis or some of the top jazz artists playing in New York City. You could go down to the Regent and see it on screen, which must have been really pretty interesting at the time, long before you had MTV or anything like that.
Sure, that'd be great, yeah. Now, beyond the downtown area, I'm thinking of like, one that makes me, sort of sad in a way is, besides Newport, because I had personal experience with Newport, but there was a Belmont Theater, and it looks as though they put a lot of money into that, but it didn't last very long.
Right, yeah, the Belmont Theater, the building is still there. You can see it, and the only real remnant to remind you there was a theater are the three masks that are still on the side of the building.
Right.
Tragedy, comedy, and then there's a third mask, which I'm not entirely sure what it's supposed to be, but it's very interesting. But yeah, the Belmont was built in 1948 by a gentleman by the name of Peter Wellman, and Peter Wellman was really a Mahoning Valley success story. He had come here from Pennsylvania. One time or another, he operated about 14 theaters in the area, including most of the drive-ins. But he always wanted to own one of the downtown theaters, which he wasn't able to do. So he built the Belmont almost as competition. He really wanted to compete with the downtown theaters. It was an enormous theater, probably as beautiful as the State Theater or one of the Paramount, one of the smaller ones. And it actually had a stage on it as well, and there were some live shows there. But the downtown theaters really wanted to see the Belmont fail, and they put up some really stiff competition, tried to make it very difficult for them to get films, first-run films, and I think that probably had a lot to do with why the Belmont lasted less than 10 years, and then it became, most people would probably remember it being Atlantic Mills. It was turned into an Atlantic Mills department store. And today, I believe, the last thing I think it was Humility of Mary was storing some kind of equipment there. But the building is still there. It's actually one of the last of the old theater buildings still standing.
Right. And speaking of like the Newport, that's not there anymore. Burger King,
right?
Which is
I know. That's
sort of a drop-off.
Sad story, yes.
But could you talk a little bit about Newport?
Yeah, the Newport Theater opened in 1942. It was another theater that was built during the war. It was started before Pearl Harbor, but it was finished afterwards. And it was a neighborhood theater, and it was actually one of the first theaters that was built in one of the suburbs. It was just over the line in Boardman.
Yeah, just over.
Yeah, today I believe that the city of Youngstown has annexed that area. It's still the south side, but it was Boardman. And Peter Wellman, he did not build the theater, but he ended up owning the theater. The gentleman who opened the Belmont, and yeah, it was a very nice Art Deco theater that could seat around 900 or so people, and one screen like most of the theaters then. But It was a neighborhood theater, but one of the nicer neighborhood theaters.
Yeah.
And it was there until the 1990s, and it was open right through the 1980s.
Well, speaking of neighborhood theaters, you go on in this book, again, it's the historic theaters of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, to talk about other suburbs, Struthers, Camel, I think, and Canfield. Can you, we only have a few minutes, but what are some of the things that struck you, or what did you learn about some of those?
What was interesting was that most of the theaters, including the Nickelodeons, opened in the Central Business District. But then eventually they branched out throughout the neighborhoods in the city, and then throughout all the neighboring small kind of industrial suburbs, maybe you would call them. So yeah, almost everywhere you could think of: Camel, Struthers, Niles, Hubbard, even Canfield. And you think in the 1930s, very few people lived in Canfield.
Yeah, a few hundred,
even they had a neighborhood theater. And basically, if you think at a time before television, people had the radio and whatever live entertainment they might do in their house. Card playing was big, but other than that, you had the theaters. And so theaters were often within walking distance of most people in the area, or maybe a short bus ride away, and people might go to the theaters 2-3 times a week, to these neighborhood theaters, and they became a really popular form of entertainment. And what really killed them off was television.
Yeah.
So by the 1950s, 1960s, most of the neighborhood theaters fade away because of the advent of television.
It was interesting, though, that some of the ones that tried to hang on into the 60s, into the television era, they went for niche things. I know, like, putting in I think one of the theaters, I forget which one, has the surround sound and the, for the disaster movies and all those kind of things.
There was always, the Uptown was really a neighborhood theater, and it survived well into the 1980s. Yeah, and it did things like put in Sense-Around, which was something, was used in films like Midway and Earthquake. Gimmicky stuff. But theaters relied on a lot of gimmicks over the years to survive. I talk a little bit about some things that happened during the Depression when a lot of theaters were closing. They had things like Bank Night, which was like kind of a lottery that was hosted at the theater. Okay. Or they had things like Dish Night, where you would come to the theater, buy a ticket, and you would get a piece of flatware. Or a piece And that was popular with housewives during the Depression, and it was a gimmick that was set up with a lot of the China companies, like Homer Laughlin, and the theaters got together as a way to, hey, how do we introduce people to our China that we're trying to sell, and how do we get people back into the movie theaters when they're just worried about, trying to hang on to their job or survive?
Yeah, the Bank Night reminds me of some of the places around here with their, where the cards, you pick a card.
Yeah,
and
right.
I mean, it's similar, just getting people in the door.
Right, of course, and as we know in this area, games of chance, the lottery, very, very, very popular in this area over the years.
Well, again, we only have a minute or so to go, but again, we've been talking with Sean Posey, and he has a brand new book out about the historic theaters of Youngstown and Mahoning Valley. And where is this available? Where can you find it?
This is available in the area at places like Barnes & Noble and Boardman and Books A Million in Warren in the Eastwood Mall. You could also, of course, find any place online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target. And then a lot of local gift shops carry it. Places like Flutterby Books in Hubbard. I believe down at Mill Creek Park at Fellows Riverside Garden, they also carry it. So you can find it at places like that, too.
Okay. And we have, this will be short. Do you have anything else coming up? I know you just got done with this.
Right. I don't know what I'm going to be working on next. Maybe I'll take a little break, but
I don't want to pressure you.
After doing 2 back-to-back. But I have some the things I'm working on now. If you go on Facebook and follow my page, there's a page for this book, Historic Theaters of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, and there's a page called Lost Youngstown for my other book, which you can see a lot of videos. I'm working with a videographer friend of mine, and we're making a lot of videos based on chapters in the book. So you can go on there and get a little bit more in-depth, or you see a little bit more pictures of video footage. Here's some more of the stories that we weren't able to put in the book.
Thanks a lot. Again, you've been watching Senior Focus. I'm your host, Bill Adams. Senior Focus comes to you thanks to Greg Roten of Armstrong, and also thanks to the Youngstown Public Library. Thank them for the meeting room. Finally, thanks to you for watching. We'll see you next time.